We come now in 1 Peter 3 to what is widely recognized as one of the most difficult texts in the New Testament. It's a passage which has generated numerous differing interpretations. The idea of Christ descending into hell after his death has been supported from this text. The idea that maybe the dead get a second chance to hear the gospel has been seen here. The idea that the pre-incarnate Christ himself preached in the days of Noah is another interpretation. Also, there's an obviously important yet difficult reference to Christian baptism here. One commentator says that given the various challenges in the text, given its complexity, there are about 180 possible combinations or choices any interpreter faces here. That being said, we do not lose heart. We are not here to solve all these issues. We are here to listen to the Word of God. And the main point of this passage, I think, is clear enough. And indeed, it's very important to the scattered exiles then and now, and we must always keep that in sight. So with that, we'll make 3 points. The victory, that'll be in verses 18 and 22, the victory. The proclamation in verses 19 and 20, and baptism in verse 21. So first on the victory. Peter had concluded the previous passage by saying it is better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Here, he's going to show us why this is the case. He has already spoken of Christ's unjust suffering on the cross. And indeed, our blessing is rooted in the imitation of Christ and in participation in his sufferings. And he begins here by returning to the center, that is, to the cross. Verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins. Jesus' suffering is not merely the suffering of an innocent victim, though it is that. He suffered once and for all time is what's intended here, and he suffered for sins. His death is vicarious, meaning he takes our place. He is our substitute. All of that is packed into the little word for. Christ suffered for sins. The righteous for the unrighteous. So the substitution here is total. We are unclean. We are guilty. We are accursed. We are unrighteous. And Christ, holy, innocent, the righteous one, bears the curse for us. This is atonement. And if you reject this atonement, you will have other scapegoats and other victims in an endless attempt to wipe away guilt, which without this cross will always remain and resurface. Peter said earlier in this chapter that Christ suffered for us so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. Here he says, Christ died for us to bring us to God. To bring us to God. It doesn't get simpler than that. Why did Christ die? To bring you, who were alienated, who were without God in the world, to God. Communion with the triune God is the reason. It's not one reason among others, right? It's not a means to an end. It is the reason for, it is the goal of the atoning work of Jesus Christ. The work of Christ is further described when Peter says he was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. This does not refer to two parts of Christ, like his body and his spirit. This refers to two orders of existence. Christ dies in this age, or in the realm of the flesh, and Christ is raised in the power of the age to come in the realm of the spirit. So this is simply a reference to Christ's death and to his resurrection in the power of the Spirit. Now, I want to jump ahead just to point out the overall flow of this text so that we don't get bogged down in the difficult middle section. So let's note this. Peter who has set the cross of Christ before us vividly, now stresses the resurrection as the sequel to the cross. He was made alive. He was raised in the Spirit. And then, after mentioning the resurrection, again, mentions it again at the end of verse 21, he says in verse 22, he has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. It's a clear reference to the ascension of Christ and to his enthronement over all of the powers. So the text is about Christ's death, Christ's resurrection, and Christ's ascension to the right hand of God. When we step back from all the complexity, that's the structure of the text, right? Thus, it is about Christ's triumph to bring us to God, for he is bringing many sons to glory. This is important, right, to suffering and afflicted and beleaguered exiles. And Peter, remember, is encouraging Christians oppressed by the powers. Christ, who was reviled without reviling in return. Christ, who refused to retaliate, who refused to threaten. Christ, who submitted to the powers that be, is now exalted with all the powers in submission to him. And thus, Christians, in their suffering, in their being drawn into the mystery of Christ, even in their martyrdom, are already participating in and by that very suffering, not in spite of that suffering, but in and by that very suffering, in the victory of his resurrection and ascension. Right? This is how we partake and taste of the victory of Christ in this age. The Christ you are united to is exalted. That's the dominant message of the passage. He died to bring us to God. Right? Thus we are to follow, and we shall follow in his footsteps. From cross to crown, from weakness to glory. His humiliation teaches us the way of non-retaliation, the way of meekness. His exaltation gives us courage and grounds our hope of heavenly glory. Christ is triumphant, and Peter's flock, and all the suffering, socially marginalized saints do and shall share his victory. That is the victory, the cruciform victory of Christ in this age. Okay, so our second point then is the proclamation. Now comes the fun part. Verse 19, and being made alive in the Spirit, or in which, meaning in the Spirit, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, spirits who seem to date back to the time of Noah. Now, the fact that some sort of proclamation is being made by Christ is beyond dispute. But here are the big questions. When did this happen? Where did it happen? To whom did Jesus make this proclamation? And what did he proclaim? When, where, to whom, and what? Let's take them briefly, one at a time. When? After his resurrection, at the time of his ascension. The text demands this to be the time of the proclamation. Where? In the realm of the Spirit. For Christ is addressing imprisoned spirits. So in the place the principalities and powers dwell, the proclamation is made. To whom? To whom does Jesus make proclamation? Spirits who were disobedient during the days of Noah. Long ago, when God waited patiently while the ark was being built. You might ask, why these beings in particular? We will get to that. But it's pretty clear that that's who is being addressed here. What does Christ proclaim to them? He proclaims his victory. The text is about his victory, as verse 22 makes clear. His victory is an announcement of their doom. Not only their doom, but the final doom of all fallen angels and authorities and powers which are already subjected to the ascended Christ. Now, one might ask, again, but why the spirits in Noah's day? And the reason appears to be that Peter thinks that Christians live in times similar to Noah. Similar to the time of Noah, the building of the ark, and the waiting for the cataclysmic judgment to fall. For example, Jesus says this in Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all." And one thing is clear in this letter, right? Peter thinks the end of all things is at hand. That judgment is about to begin. We will see that more clearly in chapter 4, if it's not clear enough already. And 2 Peter, the second epistle from this apostle, 2 Peter 3, makes it clear that the world of Noah was destroyed by water, and that the present heavens and earth will be destroyed by fire. So Noah is a picture of the church, Peter says. And the whole Noahic era is a kind of mini history of the world, where God gathers out a remnant, where evil increases, and where the end comes in a flood or a deluge of judgment. So in the ark Noah built, the text says, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. Through the sifting judgment ordeal of water where one is either drowned by it or saved through it. And Peter's flock is few in number as well. But they too will certainly be saved through the coming fiery judgment ordeal. Noah and Peter's readers are both beleaguered minorities. They are both called to witness to the patience and the coming judgment of God, which was and which is soon to fall. Listen to Peter pull a bunch of these themes together in 2 Peter chapter 2. He says this, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment." Right? So there, Peter is telling you, the experience of Noah is the experience of the church in light of the coming eschaton. This is why the victory proclamation is to the spirits from the day of Noah, now imprisoned or restrained by God for the day of judgment. That judgment day has arrived in the ascension, in the victory procession of Christ over all the powers. And their doom, the doom of these spirits, means the doom of all evil spirits. And it means also the final vindication of the suffering church. So just to be clear, there is no descent into the underworld here, right? Where Christ is seen to be preaching in hell or something to that effect, though that has been popular historically. Nor is there some sort of second chance for the dead to get the gospel proclaimed to them, though that has had its advocates as well. This is the preaching, the victory proclamation of the risen and ascended Christ to the defeated powers. That's the proclamation. Okay, our third point here is baptism. Baptism. Noah's household was saved through water, and this water symbolizes baptism, the text says. So the Noahic flood is a type or a picture, a foreshadowing of Christian baptism. Or to put it the opposite way, the waters of Christian baptism point back to the waters of the flood. When received and responded to in faith, they are healing, cleansing waters. But if one rejects the preaching, first of Noah, then of the gospel of Christ, then the waters become a deluge of judgment. So what the flood pictured or prefigured, what the flood was a type of, baptism is, namely an eschatological judgment ordeal. The future judgment day is brought to bear on the person baptized. That is why baptism saves not, Peter says, not through a removal of dirt from the body, but by an oath or a pledge or an appeal of a clear conscience to God. The ritual of baptism does not save you, right? Even the initial washing does not save. Baptism places a person under an oath. It is a pledge. It is a promise to live with a clear and sprinkled conscience before God. And this is why baptism needs to be publicly renewed in the supper. Baptism is a pledge or an appeal, right? An appeal through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Peter says in our text, to God for a good conscience. So baptism is a pledge, and that pledge must be owned. It must be publicly fulfilled. Thus, people come to the supper to fulfill their baptismal oath, to have their consciences before God sprinkled with the blood of Christ, to manifest what they have pledged, what they have been sealed with in their baptism, namely a clear conscience. The waters, then, the waters of baptism, are designed by God to drown, to destroy, to judge, to conquer all our enemies, sin, death, and the powers arrayed against us. But again, just to be clear, when we say baptism now saves, we don't mean that in abstraction from Jesus Christ. This whole passage is about our union with Jesus in his death, his resurrection, and his ascension, which of course can never be separated from one another. So Peter concludes here that baptism saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All the way back now, we have an echo to the opening of the book. Peter has already said in chapter 1 that we were born again. That too is baptismal language. We were born again through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And here he reiterates the point. Baptism joins you to the crucified and risen Christ, and that is why it saves. Right? Jesus has undergone the great eschatological judgment ordeal on the cross. Right? All hell, all the fire of the coming wrath, of the coming judgment, all of the forces of spiritual darkness were loosed on him. A flood of evil, a deluge of judgment. And he has prevailed. He has been raised in triumph, and he has proclaimed that triumph to the powers. And he's ascended into heaven, into the highest heavens, before the face of God, where he is seated at the right hand of God, with angels and authorities and powers in submission to him, under his feet. Echoing all the way back to Genesis 1, where all things are to be put under the feet of the second Adam. And baptism, Peter is saying, joins you to that victory. And it pledges, it binds you by an oath to live out that union with Christ in a clear conscience toward God. So let's, in closing, very briefly, look at how this advances Peter's argument in the letter so far. Christians are aliens, sojourners, exiles with a heavenly inheritance, and Peter expects suffering. He fixes the church's hope on the future coming of Christ. He exhorts us to patient submission in imitation of the Master's cross. He exhorts us to nonviolent suffering and waiting. But here he reminds them, and he reminds us, that Christ is risen, that he's victorious over the powers, and that he has ascended into heaven. And he calls them, as he calls us, to remember that their baptism, like the waters of Noah, pledges final vindication of God's scattered flock. And so we who lack any earthly power, and who in any event do not use earthly weapons, for we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, right? So we bear witness. We live out our baptismal oath. We confess the faith, knowing that, like the preaching of Noah, it is a sign of the coming doom of the already defeated demonic hosts. And let me say that again, right? We live out our baptisms, knowing that, like the preaching of Noah, it is a sign of the coming doom of the already defeated demonic hosts. For Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ has ascended, Christ has proclaimed his triumph, Christ is seated at God's right hand with angels and authorities and powers in submission to him. And you are joined, we are joined in all our distress, in all our suffering, in all our weakness, in all our darkness and doubt, in all of our social and political upheaval and impotence. We are joined to this Lord of glory and to his cosmic victory. Praise be to God. Amen.